Alright, in this tutorial, I'm going to go through, I'm going to use my high poly sword and my low poly sword to generate some textures. So, in my previous tutorials, we modeled the sword, we went through a UV unwrapped it, and then we went through and did a pass to create a high poly and low poly using NURMs. So I'm going to right click and say unhide all. And so you can see that right now, the two objects, they sit in exactly the same space. And that's what you need to do when you're dealing with high poly and low poly modeling, because the low poly data is going to be baking from the high poly to generate its textures. Up here, previously I had gone in and created named selection sets. I'm going to go in and select my high poly sword, right click and say hide unselected. I'm now going to go ahead and open up the material editor. To open up the material editor, you only need to just hit M on your keyboard, and that should open up the material editor for you. Now for my high poly, I'm going to go ahead and add multiple materials to it. So I'm going to right click here and right click and say assign multi-subobject material. Now this sword had previously been set up to use multi-subobject materials. Alright, so I have more than one material assigned to this main sword. So this is my high poly. I'm going to come over here to modify, make sure NURMs is set. So if I right click and say unhide, so now you see my low poly and my high poly are here. I'm going to double check my low poly by coming in and selecting the low poly. There it is, this is low poly. I'm going to put an unwrap on, open the UV editor, and there we go. So there's my sword, there's its UVs. They've been stretched over so that they fill the full screen. And because they've been stretched, I'm going to need to make sure that my textures that I generate are going to be half as wide as they are tall. So twice as tall as they are wide. So I could just right click and say collapse 2 for the low poly. So now the next step at this point is I need to take my low poly mesh and export that out, and I need to export out my high poly as well. So let me go ahead and pause the tutorial, get ready for that. Okay, so I have a folder that's ready for me to export. I have my low poly selected, and I'm just going to come over here and do File, Export, Selected, and then I've already copied the path. So I'm going to paste that in here and hit Enter, and now I'm in that location, and I just give it a name. I'll call this sword underscore LP. I'm saving as an FBX file. Now I click at Save. The default, we could go to Media and Entertainment, and under Geometry, you just want to make sure you turn on Smoothing Groups, which switches it to be user defined. I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to right click and hide that. I could also just simply come up to the top and select my high poly that way. And then I do File, Export Selected, and I give it a name. So this needs to be a separate file, HP. Save. Okay, so I'm going to unhide all, and just to reiterate, I'm going to select and move to the side. This is, I'm moving these to the side so you can see the comparison. My low poly sword has only one material assigned to it. My high poly sword has a multi-subobject material with multiple materials. My low poly sword is the only one that's UV unwrapped. The high poly is not. So I can move that. I'm just going to undo to move that sword back, and they both need to sit in exactly the same location in the world. I'm now going to pause the tutorial while I go through and open up Substance Painter, the software that we're going to use to generate our materials. Alright, I'm in Substance Painter. Software is opened up. You'll probably get a welcome screen. You can close that. It may ask you to download a new version. I'm going to say no. At school, you won't be able to download a new version anyways. So here we go. I'm going to come up here to the top, and first thing I'm going to do is do New, and I'm going to use the Unreal Engine 4 template. All right, that's a great one to use. It's incredibly useful for what we're going to be doing since we're doing game art, and we're going to be covering Unreal Engine 4. There's other templates in here, and you feel free to explore those. So I'm going to click under File, I'm going to click Select, and I'm just going to paste that package in there. It's going to take me to the sword textures, right, where I save those out. I'm going to select that and say Open. I want my document resolution at 2048, and I'm just going to click OK. Now what that does is it loads in my sword. So I'm holding Alt And clicking a negative space, that allows me to navigate around. I'm going to click here, and if I click Alt in this window, it rotates. If I hold the middle mouse button, that allows me to pan. So I'm going to zoom out, scrolling the middle mouse wheel. And so what we're seeing here is this is the two-dimensional UV view. And what's great about Substance Painter is you actually see your full materials assigned to it inside here with the lighting inside the editor. This is my 3D view. This is my 2D view. My layout is a little bit different from what you have at school. The main things you're going to need, you got layers over here, and you're going to want to find your texture set settings. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to unlock the texture set settings. And I'm going to change this first value to 1024 because that's going to be my width, right? Like how wide it is. And this is going to be my height. Now let me just double check that. All right. If I'm not right, we'll know in a second, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake out my textures. So I'm going to click Bake Mesh Maps. And inside here, I need to do the same thing. I'm going to change it to 1024 by 2048. And so inside here, I need to go through, and I'm going to define my high poly mesh. I click on this little tab, select my Sword HP, and say Open. And now I'm going to come over here to ID. And because we assign materials to it, we can generate what's called an ID map. I click on Vertex Color and select Material Color. Go back up to Common. And I'm going to click Bake Material Meshes. Probably what you should do before you do this is save. All right, it's going to be important that you go through and save what you have because the school computers have a tendency to crash when baking. All right, so now when I scroll through here, you can see the textures that I generated, and you see that they are narrower as they're basically they're half size, right? And so this is exactly what I was hoping to get these generated for my sword. All right, so there we go. There's my low poly version. It's got the nicer looking textures baked out on it. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and just remove this layer, and I'm going to put a folder in its place. So now what I can do is I can come over here to these basic materials, and I can start dropping these in. So let's go ahead, let's find one. I'm going to go ahead and for my sword, I'm going to put, let's not start with the sword. Let's do something a little bit better, a little bit more clear and obvious here. I'm going to take leather bag, let's say. I'm going to drag that over and put that inside this folder. And now you see that material is assigned to the whole object, right? And so you can kind of see how that ends up looking. So I could go in and I could change this a couple different ways I could do it. If I right click, I can say add mask with color selection. And now if I find my properties, I can go in and pick color, and I could select the brown, and now that material is only assigned, if I hold Alt, I can pan here, and it's only assigned to where the leather handle is. So let's go, I'm going to click on the folder, make a new one, and let's put another material in here. Let's find us a nice kind of metal. Let's, in this case, we're going to put this brass. Let's put the brass on there. Again, I'm going to do the same thing. Come out to the folder, right click, say create mask with color selection, and select the blue. And then I could do the same thing, one more folder, and I can select a nice iron pure and throw that in there, and do the same thing, mask with color selection, and I could select that, oops, pick color, come on, pick color, and select that where the blade is. That is the most basic way to go in and get textures. Now there's a couple different things that we could do in order to work to get better textures for ourselves. So I'm going to stop this one. I'm going to do a second version for us to test out. But what you would do, you do file, probably going to want to save what you have, and then you'll export out your textures. You just click here, go to that same path, and select folder, and hit export, and that's going to save those out. There's probably going to be some warnings. You probably don't need to worry about those. You could go to textures as well, and that's where it saves out your textures. If you ever want to save those for any reason, like say you want your color map, your ID map, you could right click on that and do export resources, and you just specify that same folder and it'll export it there. Then you will see inside that folder, if I right click and do view extra large icons, you'll see here's the textures that were generated, and they're named the mesh name, the material color, and then the actual name. I like to go through and rename these to an abbreviation, because really it's just the sword underscore BC for base color. Go down to the bottom. This one is a packed material. It has occlusion, roughness, and metallic. And so if I come in here, I can name this ORM for those three maps. And this one is a normal map. This is your per vertex lighting information, so we'll just rename that. And then this guy up here, I'm just going to call it, rename it sword underscore ID. That way if I need that, if I'm reworking the map, I can have that available. Alright, and so that's kind of that general process there. I'm going to make a second version of this where we go through and we try some other techniques.